Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is KidNativeBloodyElbow.com. I'm bringing you two of the biggest authorities on the UFC Fight Pass experiment. Ian Kidd, who broke the news that it's not quite as secure as they'd like you to think, and Jonathan Snowden, a Bleacher Report, who actually got Marshall Zelaznik of the UFC to answer a few questions about the service. Guys, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. So, Ian, let's go with you first. Actually, before we get into the dark side of the UFC Fight Pass, let's talk to you, Jonathan, about the promise of what UFC Fight Pass could be and what it actually is. When they announced the service, it sounded pretty cool to me. They promised to have the complete library of every UFC fight in history, all the Pride fights, all the WEC fights, all the Affliction fights, all the Strikeforce fights, their complete Zuffa fight library. What have they actually got?
It seems like what they have is certainly not that. You know, they're definitely not at that point yet, which was kind of a huge disappointment for me. You know, because I had all these visions of great fights from years gone by that I could point readers towards. You know, that's kind of like my goal for everything when I hear about these kind of services. And, you know, I want to, you know, take some of these older fights and share them with fans. So one of the ones I thought of immediately was this fight from UFC 22, Brad Kohler against Steve Judson. And it was like a grappler versus striker fight, but one where the grappler had this tremendous knockout. And that was just an example of something I was like, hey, this is a cool fight that new fans might appreciate. And it turns out, of course, that fight wasn't on UFC Fight Pass. And hundreds, thousands of fights aren't on the UFC Fight Pass yet. So it's just kind of a real work in progress. Definitely not, at least based on what they say, this is not a finished product.
I liked the fact that they're promising that they'll have every fight available as soon as the free trial period ends, which which is really it's like a trust us, you know. That's the whole deal. Like, trust us. If you actually pay your money, you'll get all the stuff we promised when it was free and wasn't. Ian, what's your take on this whole deal? Like, do you think that? Do you want to put down a bet on whether or not that they're going to have every fight on March 1st when the free trial ends?
Man, I'd put like $1,000 that they won't. There's no way they're going to have every fight. They'll probably have enough of the library to kind of quell most of the complaints, but there's no way they're going to have the entire library up in time. I mean, they've got such a small percentage of it up just now. They've got so many UI issues they have to fix. The searching's busted. You know, it's impossible to use it as a good user experience, and there's no way they can fix that and get the thousands of fights that are still missing, all, you know, blurred out for sponsors, checked, uploaded, QA'd, put in the database. There's no way they can pull that off in the next month and a bit. They don't have the resources and they don't have the right people to do it.
Do we have any idea, like, what kind of staffing they've got on the tech side on the UFC Fight Pass system? Do you have any idea, Jonathan?
Just based on what I've heard, and just keep in mind this is just complete rumor mongering, but it's very light. You know, this is something that kind of happened a little bit out of the blue for the folks that are working on it. You know, they just apparently decided this is something they should have, and while it's taken, you know, WWE the better part of a decade to try to start digitizing all of their footage and getting it ready for this, I'm not sure the UFC was quite at that point. So they're really trying to scramble at the last minute, and the idea that they're going to suddenly get every single one of these fights up, that just seems ludicrous to me. Like, I just don't. I'm with you guys in that that's not going to happen. Especially with this, you know, you hear that they're trying to do things like remove sponsors that aren't paying them anymore, and, you know, they have to worry about the walkout music and whether or not it's licensed appropriately, and, you know, all these things that just kind of slow that process down. You know, it's going to be a long time, I think, before the idea that the entire library is going to be up there. You know, that's definitely not going to be happening in March.
And it just makes me wonder, what are they thinking making a promise like that? Like, they've already, I mean, I guess they're partners with EA Video Games, which is in the habit of releasing games that are completely unfinished and unworkable. So I guess that's their tech guidepost and what they, you know, if you train fans to expect really crappy service and unfulfilled promises, well, then the disappointment is going to be limited. But that begs the question. I do want to say one thing, though. The streams have been reliable. Compared with Invicta, the women's MMA fight promotion that's been trying to do paid internet fight streaming, which never works. Every single event, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe every single Invicta event, they've had to either refund money or just turn the stream free because the pay-per-view didn't work at all. So the Fight Pass, the debut event, UFC Singapore, has anybody heard any complaints about the delivery of that show? No. So
no.
I definitely have it.
Yeah, so there's that. But of course, they've been doing the same thing on Facebook and YouTube for quite a while. So I would honestly be pretty shocked if it was done. But now I want to get into the question of timing. Jonathan, did they just launch this to try to preempt the WWE's online network?
It seems like maybe. That they would deny that, I think. And they did deny that. The timing is just kind of coincidental. And maybe it's true. Maybe it was targeted for the first of the year. And instead of competing with WWE, really they were just kind of trying to start 2014 with this kind of in place, or the idea of it. So that's plausible. Maybe it's not connected to the WWE, but I think it was. Their idea maybe was that they would avoid some of the hard questions if they got theirs out first. Then there wouldn't be, at least in the initial press coverage of it, there wouldn't be all these comparisons with the WWE because the WWE's thing didn't exist yet. So that was kind of helpful. So in the first run of coverage that they got at MMA Junkie and all these other sites, there was no real comparison or discussion of the WWE because that wasn't a thing yet.
And this, I'm not going to ask anybody to answer this, but would MMA Junkie really have reported an in-depth comparison with the WWE program if it was going to be unfavorable for the UFC? I'm just going to leave that out there. Nobody has to answer that. But I do want to mention the reasons I think that there are perfectly logical reasons for them to have launched it when they did, irrespective of the WWE. They've got this growing international expansion, which honestly makes very little sense for Fox Sports 1 and their network partner in the U.S. They want to put these shows on in prime time in Singapore, in Macau, in the Philippines, in Australia. They don't want to be having Australian shows going on at noon on Saturday. They want them to go on prime time in Australia rather than doing the timing for the American television market. And so that's the thinking there. But, I mean, are they just spreading the butter too thin? Do they have the fights and the resources to actually pull this off? Is there demand in these international audiences? Jonathan, do you have any feel for what the hankering in the Asian market is for the UFC product?
I just don't, I don't really sense that it's there so much. I think what they're trying to do is, what they wanted to see happen was their kind of fight infrastructure build up in all these countries. There are minor league promotions in Australia or China or all over the world that are kind of developing prospects and creating interest in the sport. And I think what they've seen kind of is that has not happened to the extent they'd like it to. So that when, they bring the UFC to these countries, they're kind of starting from scratch in a lot of ways. So we get these shows from overseas that really are not what we would consider a UFC standard. They're not, the fighters are not on that level. And so I think it is kind of a good idea to have this in kind of like a separate place where only the few hardcore fans will be paying any attention to it. I don't think these are this is not the kind of product that you want to put out in front of the casual fans, the vast majority of sports fans. It's kind of it's kind of low class a little bit, a low rent product. So it does make sense to kind of stick it over here where only people that really, really care about this stuff will ever see it.
Ian, what about guys like Kawajiri or Kikono? These are guys that I think could hang in the UFC, in the real UFC, but instead they're stuck in these cards that are only seen on the Fight Pass service in the U.S. They're available in various TV outlets in Asia. I mean, are these guys just going to be in limbo for the duration of their careers, or do you see a path for these fighters to making it into the real UFC?
See, that's part of the problem. I mean, we've seen it a few guys in the past couple of years go, from the prelims to a title fight with maybe one fight in between. And, now that the prelims are on Fight Pass, the audience for those guys is going to be so significantly diminished that it's not going to make any financial sense at all for the UFC to give these guys title shots, regardless of how deserving they are, because no one knows who they are. And, do we really trust that the UFC are going to be able to bring these guys up properly and put them in the right positions and take them off Fight Pass at the right time? I'm not so sure. They don't do a great job with it already. We see guys that shouldn't be on Facebook cards just now, and those cards are going to be in Fight Pass, which is going to make it even worse. I think the UFC, unless they really get a handle on putting guys in the right place in cards, I think this is going to hurt them long term, because they are going to struggle to have challengers that the casual fan recognises in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, and they're already struggling with this. They've got Alexander Gustafsson, who just fought John Jones to a standstill, and the logical thing is a rematch for him in a title fight that could be a significant pay-per-view draw, or a decent one by today's standards. And yet his next fight is going to be against Jimmy Manawa in the UK on a card very few American fans are going to be able to see. It's very baffling to me. And also the markets that they're not hitting with Fight Pass events yet are the ones that actually seem to have some pent-up demand. It's the UK, Poland, and South Africa. I'm wondering, why isn't the UFC there? These are the places that are drawing fans to MMA events. They're not even in South Africa or Poland at all. And it just makes me wonder. And with the UK, what the UK fans really want to see is a British fighter in a title fight, which, we've seen Dan Hardy challenge GSP for a title. Michael Bisping has never made it to a title shot. And yet, when Dan Hardy did fight GSP, it wasn't in the UK. So I don't know. The whole thing makes me scratch my head. And one last thing I want to bring up on this is, before we get to the security issue, is the dearth of original programming. The WWE is cranking out documentaries and backfill. WWE has a long-standing history of putting out great DVDs that put together historical stories, plot lines from the show, and great matches. And the UFC's never done anything like that, really. They occasionally have the big KO series or the best of submissions, but their storytelling abilities are extremely limited, and yet they're promising original programming on Fight Pass. Jonathan, what do you expect to see in that way, and when do you expect to see it?
Well, that's really that was one of the questions that I asked them, because I was very curious about that. Because, the UFC has made some efforts in that direction. It's just things that no one has ever seen, because they do a terrible job of publicizing them. They have had a handful of DVD releases where they attempted some documentary content, like they've done a Horace Gracie disc, they did a Matt Hughes disc, they did a DVD about the Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz feud. They did one for Forrest Griffin, and it's just like these things are released in a vacuum. They did a Benson Henderson DVD that I called to interview him about, and he had not even seen it. He was not even necessarily aware of it. Like, it's just like these things happen, and no one ever notices them. When the WWE releases a DVD, it's a big deal. They promote it on their television show, and it's worth the effort, because they put out such a great product. And the UFC is not there yet. And while I got kind of like basically what you could only describe as vague assurances that they were going to have original programming, you have to wonder, like, what will that look like? Because they've had these relationships for years now with Spike Television and then Fox, where there were opportunities to put these kind of programs out, and it just never happened. So if Spike would have put on anything UFC related, had they wanted to do a documentary, and it never happened. So, either there's no interest or there's no talent in-house to do it. I'm not really clear, but I don't really have high expectations for whatever they're going to do, just because, they've not shown me yet that they can really do it.
Ian, do you think this is because the UFC is terrified of promoting fighters ahead of the brand? Is that the game plan? Do you have any theories as to why they can't put together compelling documentary product?
I think it's just that, as Jonathan was saying, they have no experience in it, and I don't think they have anyone in-house who's really pushing to do new and creative and important things. I don't think they have anyone there who's coming up with these great ideas. I don't think that's maybe encouraged in Zuffa. I mean, I get the argument that Dana White has always gone out of his way to make sure no one fighter's bigger than the brand, and that definitely does hurt them in terms of turning people into pay-per-view draws. But I'm not so sure that's the reason for these poor, programming quality. I think that just comes down to the UFC having no idea how to create new, engaging, creative programming based on the talent they have. I just don't think they have anyone who knows how to do it.
Yeah, Dave Meltzer really ripped into the UFC for the Wednesday night UFC Fight Night that was on Fox Sports 1 week before last or whenever it was, because it had no storytelling. It was just fight after fight after fight after fight. Even Bellator, even the World Series of Fighting does a better job of having backstory. Hell, Access TV does a better job of backstory videos about the fighters that are fighting on the former HDNet network. And when a UFC fighter goes in, you're lucky if you see their walk-in, much less a backstory, an interview, a little bit about who this guy is, where he comes from, what makes him different, why we should care about him. And it's just sort of baffling to me. My theory is that they're so overworked and that they've kept their staff so lean that they just don't have the bandwidth to even think of these things. And they're just stumbling from event to event and just cranking them out the bare minimum by rote. But I could be wrong. But let's turn to the security issue. Ian, can you give a quick summary of what exactly has you concerned about the UFC Fight Pass's digital security?
Sure. There's two specific issues. The first issue is the actual bad practices we know for a fact they have in place. And the biggest one there is they store passwords using two-way encryption. Now, they try and put people's mind at ease and say, it's PCI verified security and it's the same way people protect your credit cards. But that's not true. When you enter your credit card information, the UFC never has the key to decrypt that again. That gets sent to the credit card company. When they store your password, they have the key. They have the key to see what your password is, which means anyone who gets access to their server can also see what your password is. It's a terrible way to store passwords. It's absolutely against every decent security protocol that you'll find for running a website. Passwords should always be hashed and salted. Now, the second part is, although the credit card information and stuff is probably fine and there's no evidence to suggest otherwise, the fact that they're making such basic mistakes with security and the fact stuff's happening, like last weekend, their website had coding errors on it, their live website. That should never happen. Your live site should never have coding errors. The fact that happened suggests to me that the people the UFC have doing the programming, the people they have in charge of making the security decisions, aren't the right people. And that really worries me because it makes me wonder what else they're doing wrong that we can't see,
Yeah, and Jonathan, you got to talk to Marshall Zelaznik, the UFC VP, who's in charge of Fight Pass. Tell us what he said when you asked him about the security issues and give us your response to his answer.
Well, I think that Marshall Zelaznik probably knew just about as much as I did about it, which is nothing. So, we're kind of like playing this game where I'm reading directly from Ian's report, and he's doing his best to read off of whatever script he has, because it wasn't like a real knowledgeable conversation. But I think when I talked to other folks at the UFC, part of it is that they don't feel like there's an obligation to offer you this information. There's no obligation on their part to say this is our security protocol. I think they feel like you should just trust them, and that's kind of like how we operate. I think most of us as consumers with any site, you have to really disregard that if you want to be sane. You just have to leave yourself in their hands, and that'll be up to the individual user, I guess, to determine whether or not the UFC is a party that you can trust. We probably, most people feel like I can use eBay, I can use PayPal, I can go to Amazon.com and I'll be okay. But if it's a sketchy site selling T-shirts, maybe you think twice about it. And it's kind of like you have to decide for yourself where the UFC falls on that spectrum. And as I pointed out, even when they have had trouble with hackers, they were not able to do anything significant. So, you take that in for what it's worth and decide whether you want to give them your credit card.
And that is a good point. I mean, they had the well-publicized feud with Anonymous about a year ago, and I believe that the kid in question got arrested. I don't know if he's doing jail time yet, but it doesn't look good for his case. They hacked the UFC website and published what he claimed was Dana White's personal info, not all of which turned out to be accurate. So I mean, maybe there is something to that. And also, on the other hand, we're living in a world where Target just got hacked in store. I mean, it wasn't even online. It was actually giving your credit card at the cash register, and their entire cash register system got hacked. So on the one hand, maybe things aren't as bad as we're afraid vis-a-vis the UFC. And on the other hand, you can't trust anybody. So it's sort of alarming to me that the UFC's procedures are noticeably sloppy, and that they're an organization that has gotten on the wrong side of groups like Anonymous in the past. So as somebody who lived through the Stratfor hack and lost, got my personal information revealed because of Anonymous before, even though I'm generally sort of an anonymous supporter, I know how inconvenient and upsetting that can be. And my only advice is definitely don't use a password that you use on any other site on UFC Fight Pass. And Ian, some people have said that you can use temporary cards, like a prepaid card you bought at CVS, but I had some trouble trying to do that because there wasn't an address linked to the card, and they wouldn't do my authorization, so I just had to use a credit card. I definitely didn't use a debit card. Do you know anything about that? Is there a safe, what's the most cautious approach to sharing credit card information with UFC Fight Pass?
Well, ideally what would happen is the UFC would implement something like PayPal, which is significantly safer. But if that's not an option, there are services like there's a service called MaskMe, and what it does is it will give the site your credit card information, but it will redact as much of it as possible, which means that the site only gets the bare minimum it needs, and that will help protect you. But temporary credit cards, if you can get them to work, are definitely the best option anytime you're buying anything from someone who isn't a major player. If it's not, Amazon.com or something, you really don't want to be giving them your real credit card details. And, as you say, the Target hack shows that, anyone can get hacked. So the companies that do have your information, you want to make sure it's companies that are going to do everything they can to protect it. So even if someone does get access to the system, which these days is almost inevitable, you're still relatively safe.
Cool. All right. And so let's wrap it up. Jonathan, where do you see UFC Fight Pass in 1 year? How much of the library do you expect to see online? What kind of original programming do you expect to see? And how popular do you think the service is going to be?
Well, I would hope by the end of this calendar year they would certainly be able to live up to their promise for it to be, that we expected, what we expected when we first signed up should be there by the end of the year, I would hope. In 12 months' time they can live up to that. As far as the original programming, I certainly hope at least they have one or two original documentaries of some sort. There still hasn't been a really good UFC documentary that's focused on those early years. It's been one of those topics that, like, when you look at what ESPN has done with 30 for 30 and then the follow-ups to 30 for 30, there hasn't, they've just kind of ignored MMA completely. And so we're still kind of waiting for that first great documentary feature about this sport, and I would love to see that on UFC Fight Pass, and hopefully they can deliver something like that. There's no reason that they can't. In fact, as far as they have all the resources, they have all the tools, they have all the video, they have all the people there to tell all these great stories. It's just a matter of whether or not they want to invest in it, and that'll be the key to its success, I think. We don't know now if this is just like a repository for old fights to sit there, and it's impossible to search, and they don't do much in the way of pointing people to them or making them compelling or making them relevant with this kind of documentary content, then I think it's probably not going to be that successful. I think there's a handful of the hardcore fans that want to see these fights, the live fights, who will sign up. I think that'll be the driver if there's nothing else great coming out of Fight Pass. And in that case, Woody, you're talking about what's a good guess for that? 100,000 if you're being ambitious? I'm not sure. I don't have any idea what the metrics will be.
Yeah. Ian, do you have any thoughts about where you expect UFC Fight Pass to be in a year?
I don't think this is going to be much of a success at all. As Jonathan alluded to, there's nothing to drag in the casual fan. And, if you look at what the WWE are expecting to do, they're expecting to have, 1 million subscribers by the end of the year minimum. And the UFC have no chance of getting anywhere near that. I think Fight Pass is going to end up being more of a financial drain than a boon to them, and it wouldn't surprise me to see it as something that gets kind of left in a corner to sort of gather dust a little bit rather than being improved and made attractive over the next year or two.
Wow, that's pretty harsh, but I can't say I disagree. I think it's going to live or die based on how hard they continue to push the international expansion and how much fans want to see these early prelim fights. It seems like every fight card is going to have at least 1 or 2 events that are going to be on Fight Pass only. And I know, as somebody who runs a website, that losing those free online fights for some of these events, that was the only interest the cards would draw, was when we were able to embed the fights, the first couple prelims, on the site. And so it hurts us, and I just have to wonder how much it's going to hurt the UFC itself. So, well, thanks guys for doing this. We're going to post this on Bloody Elbow next week. We're going to sort of turn it